Jesus and his disciples sat down opposite to the temple treasury and observed how the crowd handed over their donations. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow also came and put in 2 small coins. Calling his disciples to himself, he said to them, "Truthfully, I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the other contributors to this treasury, for they have all contributed from their abundant wealth, but she, from her poverty, has contributed all she had, her whole livelihood." The story of the widow's mite, also called the widow's offering, is fascinating. This is the smallest denomination mentioned in the Bible, the coin of least individual value. However, as with any ancient text translated and replicated over the centuries, things might get mixed in translation. Names were adapted for easier comprehension of different peoples around the world once the Bible started being translated to modern languages, and the coin from the story ends up assuming lots of different names that in many cases don't even fit the description of a small valued coin accurately. For example, for those who read the Bible in English, the term generally used is Mite, which comes from Mite, a small medieval fractional coin with very little value. Some modern translations even call the coin of the story a cent, like in a modern 1-cent coin. Other languages, for example Spanish, call the coin Óbolo de la Viuda. An obo was generally a silver coin. It was small, but it was absolutely not the smallest denomination. It was actually a respectable amount of money. Whoever translated it most likely picked the word for the fact the obo was physically small. Other languages are even more problematic, such as Portuguese, where it was translated as tostão, a very long-lived denomination, introduced in the 15th century as a valuable silver coin, which eventually became a lower value bronze coin after centuries of inflation. For the average Portuguese speaker, the word tostão isn't problematic. It is actually an expression for a small amount of money. But of course, any numismatist would be left scratching their heads like, this is supposed to be a valuable coin. As another example, the French translation denier de la veuve is also weird. Denier. So you see, 2 major translations of the Bible to French were made. One in 1295, based on texts written in Vulgar Latin, and a later one in 1530 from the Hebrew and Greek originals. The use of denier in the 1530 version is actually adequate. It was then a tiny coin with very small value. However, in 1295, a denier was a valuable coin of good silver. If you donated 2 deniers at Mass, the priest would certainly be impressed. I mean, I don't need to go on more examples, you get my point. Modern translations will not help us figure out which actual coin was the one donated by the widow. We need to go to the sources in Greek and look at what kinds of coins were actually circulated in Judea around the time of the ministry of Jesus. Let me show you a strong candidate. There was this very common coin that circulated in Judea, the pruta. I'm showing you one on your screen now. These were probably introduced around 135 BC and kept being issued until 59 AD, so a pretty long run. What can we say about these coins? Well, they were small, they were very crudely made. Theoretically, they were made out of 2.5 grams of copper, although their weight varies a lot, and it had very small purchasing power. For you to buy a loaf of bread, you typically needed 10 of them. A single pruta could maybe buy you a lemon or a small pomegranate. Sometimes multiples of the pruta were issued, like 2, 4, and 8 prutot, likely for the sake of practicality. And there were also half pruta issued, even if I personally question the practicality of issuing such a small denomination, but we will get to these in a moment. First, let's maybe have a look at this first example we have here to illustrate what we're talking about. This is a pruta issued by Alexander Jannaeus between 103 and 76 BC, so a fairly early piece, struck nearly a century before the birth of Christ. But these coins apparently circulated for a very long time, and it wasn't uncommon to find century-old pruta circulating in the 1st century AD. By the nice shape this particular example is in, I wouldn't bet it circulated for very long before being hoarded and forgotten. It looks unusually sharp for the type. In fact, this particular example is almost as good as these coins get. As you can see, there wasn't a whole lot of attention given to guaranteeing these coins were perfectly round. I've actually seen a few square prutot. These were produced in a rush and there was not a whole lot of attention given to the quality of the coin. They just needed to spill out as many as possible. As for the designs, on the obverse we have a wheel. It's actually this nice design that mixes a wheel, a very obvious symbol of commerce, very adequate for this coin, with this 8-ray star. You see in the center there's like a star, and between each spoke of the wheel, or arms of the star, there's a letter of Alexander's name in Paleo-Hebrew, in the Paleo-Hebrew language, and it translates to Yehonatan the king. This example is remarkably well centered. It's hard to find coins like this. And on the reverse we have an anchor. There are two interesting theories for this design. One claims this is a reminiscent design from the Seleucid Greeks who controlled Judea in previous centuries and issued coins with the anchor as their royal symbol, and this design continued being used for tradition. After all, people were always very reticent to change the traditional designs on money. But there's also another plausible explanation that these celebrate Alexander's expansion of Judean territory towards the sea, from the interior of the continent towards the coastline. The legends of the reverse are in Greek, the lingua franca of the entire eastern Mediterranean throughout most of antiquity. It reads, Basileus Alexandrou, coin of King Alexander, basically a translation to Greek of the obverse, making this a bilingual coin. And well, that would solve the issue, right? The Windows Mite was the pruta, a low-value denomination coin, very common and widespread throughout the region, and accessible even to someone like a poor widow, right? Well, I am not entirely sure, and that's because of what is written on scripture. There are two instances of the story of the widow, in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, and both refer to the coin as lepton, which means something minute, something minuscule, basically the smallest coin in circulation. And on the Gospel of Mark, there's an interesting extra to the story, since it was most likely written to a Roman audience. After saying the poor widow put 2 lepta in the basket, he says the 2 coins were of low value. He makes the claim that these 2 coins make a quadrans. Now, the quadrans was a Roman denomination, while the pruta was a local Jewish coin. However, both were roughly the same size and metal composition. They were around 2.5 grams and they were made out of copper. Here on your screen is a coin issued by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who presided over Judea at the time of the Christ's crucifixion. It isn't unreasonable then to say that around the time of Christ at least, a pruta and a quadrans were probably worth the same. This means the lepton referenced in scripture is actually the half pruta that were issued by some of the Hasmonean kings. During the time of Christ, when the Romans ruled over Judea, this denomination apparently wasn't issued anymore. Only the full pruta and some multiples were made. But as we've seen, older coins still circulated, so half pruta could be the coins handled by the widow. This actually shows a remarkable attention to detail and even a certain numismatic knowledge on the part of Mark. And since I just mentioned Pontius Pilate, let's take a look at this pruta issued under his governorship, right? On the obverse, we have a reference to the Roman emperor, to Tiberius. It reads in Greek, Tiberios Kaisaros, Tiberius Caesar, with a litus, a ceremonial rod used by the Roman priests on their ceremonies as a central device. This design might have been problematic for the Jews who used this coin. It makes reference to a foreign religion, so it could have been seen as sacrilegious. On the reverse, we have a wreath, once more a Roman symbol of power. And at the center, first, a letter, which represents the Greek word for year, and then a number 17, as in the 17th year of the reign of Tiberius, which would be the equivalent of our year 30 in the Gregorian calendar, meaning this particular piece was issued around the time of the ministry of Christ. Fascinating. Now, I know I'm showing you a couple of pruta, even though I've just mentioned that the coin the widow was handling was probably half a pruta, but you know what? Let me make a statement of practicality here. What I mean by this is, in reality, there are two ways of interpreting this passage. We can, on one hand, observe scripture to the letter, so if it says it was a half pruta, that's it. On the other hand, if we imagine ourselves there with Christ and the apostles, observing the widow from, let's say, 5 meters away, would you be able to distinguish one coin of 15 millimeters in diameter from one which is, 9 millimeters? Could you tell a full from a half pruta from a distance? I don't know, Mark must have been the man with the best eyesight in all of Judea then. Full pruta were issued for a longer period of time and seem to be more common than the lepta. Both were, equally negligible amounts of money, and I'm not discarding the evidence that the widow's mite was a lepta, but I'm just saying that due to the sheer number of pruta in circulation, it could perfectly be a full pruta as well. In reality, we will never know. And if you are a collector of biblical coins, this is a perfect excuse for you to succumb to the capital sin of greed and you just buy 2 coins instead of 1. You just make sure you get a half pruta and a full pruta, and you know you got the widow's mite just because you got both types. So before we wrap up, why don't we look at another pruta? That's a cool one, issued under Herod the Great. Herod deposed the Hasmonean dynasty and reigned as a new king of Judea, with the status as a client king of Rome. There's an interesting passage at the Gospel of Matthew which says, Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem during the reign of King Herod. This generates a chronological paradox with the Gregorian calendar we use today. Using this calendar as a reference, Herod died in 4 BC, meaning Jesus must have been born at least 4 years before our year 1 AD. In fact, many believe he was born between 6 and 4 BC, but since our calendar has been around for so long, no one really thinks about cutting a few years from our current year count. And this is an interesting fact that illustrates, it shows how powerful social conventions like dates can be once enough people accept it, even if the convention we use is technically incorrect. So let's take a look at this pruta, which could also be a widow's mite. On the obverse, we have once again the anchor, the symbol of the old Seleucids, with the legends in Greek around it, an abbreviation form for Basileus Herodos, King Herod. On the reverse, a very sacrilegious symbol for the Jews, I would say. It actually surprised me a bit. We have at the center a caduceus, the symbol of commerce, associated with the Greek god Hermes, and around it, 2 cornucopias, the magical horns of abundance, which also come from Greek mythology. Was this maybe a design imposed by Rome? So yeah, if we go back to our initial question, which coin was the widow's mite coin? Sadly, we might never have a complete answer. Hopefully this video at least has shed some light on which coins could have been it. Any pruta or half pruta, lepta, struck from the time of the introduction of the denomination in the 2nd century BC all the way to the 30s AD during the ministry of Christ could be the coin. Sadly, the only way we will know for certain is if we have a time machine. Now, how about you let me know in the comment section below which coin you think is the widow's mite. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Leave a like, consider subscribing and becoming a channel member if you did to support my work, and I'll see you soon. Let me give a special thank you to all of my amazing channel members and Patreons for their generous support. This channel would not be the same without your help. And if you would like to be part of this list, have early access to my videos when they are uploaded to YouTube, and a series of other perks, make sure to check out my Patreon page and my members tab on YouTube. Thank you very much.